Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Arturia Augmented Brass tutorial series. Going to have a look at a couple of tabs today, the Arpeggiator and Effects tabs. We'll spend most of the time in the Arpeggiator. It's a really lovely tool, this one. Hope you're enjoying the series so far, and if you are, please check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. It's an awesome way to help support my channel. As you can see, I've loaded up the Brass Dreamland preset. I'm going to press a C on the keyboard, and this is what you're going to hear. Now that demonstrates the Arpeggiator really well, and it's a nice preset to use, but there's a confusing factor here. I'm just going to jump over to the Effects tab and turn off this pitch shift delay. This is responsible for some of those octave bounces, and it's just a little bit confusing. I'm just going to turn that off. The rest of the demonstration is absolutely fine with this preset. Okay, first things first, without any pitch shifting, here's what a single note sounds like. Have a look at this chord row. Every time we hit one of these chord blocks, a full chord is being played. I'm only pressing a single note, I'm just pressing C on the keyboard, but we're obviously hearing much more than that. What's actually happening is that a full chord is being played, and it's determined by this chord select button. When we click that, you see the notes that are being played when it hits one of these coloured boxes and the chord feature is enabled. It's playing an open voiced C major 7. So we've got C, G, B, and E, and the E is basically an octave apart of separated from where it should be. Those are just interval patterns. Any note that I play is going to be transposed up, so when I press the D, it's playing an open voiced D major 7. All of those notes have been transposed to semitones. If I drop this E down to where it should be, so that now I'm playing a completely traditional C major 7 with closed voicing, we're still hearing higher notes, but that's because of another function. The Arpeggiator is doing multiple things simultaneously here. I'll put the sequence back to the way it was. That's just to prove that these intervals really do make a difference. It's going to play these 4 notes, and then additional layers of complexity are being added to it. So let's come out of there and have a look at what else is going on. Well, this is a 16-step sequence. We have these bars at the end of the sequence to indicate how long the arpeggio is going to be. So if I move it there, it's now only going to play 10 steps. I'll play the same note again. This time it wraps around at this bar marker. So we're playing a 16-step sequence here, but 3 of the steps are being ignored. 2, 10, and 13 have been disabled. So the step row indicates whether or not that note is played at all. If I turn them back on, let's listen to it now. Now, it's all very well and good to say that 16 steps are being played, and technically that's correct, but some of these notes have very low velocity. So we have a velocity graph. That's what this row is doing. These markers here, if you hover over them, the pop-up says set the velocity for the given step. Well, 5 of the steps have a very low velocity. It's not 0. Some sound is escaping, but it's very quiet and it's making it sound like there are gaps. Let's just make a note of 3, 5, 8, 12, 15. I'll reduce these velocities again in a moment. I'm just going to bring them all up. Play the sequence once more. Now it really is playing all 16 steps, still slightly velocity separated, but now we don't have that quite so dramatic. See if I can remember. 3, 5, 12, 8, 3, 5, 8, 12, 15. I think it was those 5. Yeah, that sounds about right. So the relationship of all of these different step settings is making for this really interesting and dynamic sound. This feature in particular, playing an entire chord on only certain steps of the Arpeggiator, is absolutely brilliant. I don't remember seeing this in any other plugin. I'm sure it exists elsewhere, but it's completely perfect for this environment because that's what brass arpeggios do. You want those stabs. I'm going to throw away all of those changes just so that I can get back to some sort of level playing field and disable my pitch shift delay again. This time I'm going to play something that's deliberately discordant. I'm going to play a C with an F sharp above it. And when I hold both of those notes down simultaneously, when we hit the chord sections, both of those chords will play in their entirety. So you're going to get a C major 7 and an F sharp major 7. They're going to have dissonant notes. This is going to clash. If we disable the chord feature and I just play those two notes, all you're going to hear now are C's and F sharps spread across 2 octaves. Which is obviously quite dissonant in its own right, because that's a tritone. The F sharp is 6 semitones above the C. But at least they're widely separated and you're not getting violent note next to note clashes. Let's focus in a little bit more carefully on what's happening when we press a chord in relation to this chord mode. So I'm going to play the C and F sharp. I'm going to bring it down to a single octave. So now it's only playing the notes that I'm asking it to play. It's not bouncing anywhere else. So I'm holding C and F sharp simultaneously. So now you can hear it's not playing that C major 7 anymore. The thing that was selected in our chord select screen, that's not happening. What is happening is that any notes I have pressed down on the keyboard are all playing simultaneously. So you are hearing that diminished fifth interval, the tritone, that those two notes are playing simultaneously. And then when we bring the second octave in, you're getting those higher notes bounce up as well. So the chord markers are always playing exactly the notes I'm asking it to, and then the arpeggio is following its own rules in the background, so there's this structured pattern by which the arpeggio is played. I absolutely love figuring out how arpeggiators work. This stuff keeps me awake at night. So what I'm basically trying to identify here is whether the arpeggio is identical every time round. If I make it much shorter, it should be really easy to spot what's going on. It is playing exactly the same thing every time. Is that because we have an even number of divisions? Let's make it 5. They're not identical every time round. The high brief note is sometimes on step 5 and sometimes on step 3. So the arpeggio is following its own intrinsic rules and it doesn't reset every time we get back round to the beginning again. It's constantly in forward progression. The number of keys that you press, the number of octave spans that you have, the type of the arpeggio that you specify, they all tie in to how this pattern is going to work. You can't make any presumptions about whether or not it's going to be cyclic. That's made even more complicated by 2 different kinds of up and down arpeggios. We have exclusive and inclusive notes, and this is all about whether or not the extreme notes are played once or twice. So if you have a 3-note arpeggio, is it 1 2 3 2 1 2 3 2 1, or 1 2 3 3 2 1 1 2 3 3? See what I mean? Love it, love it, love it, love it. Let's have an example of this stuff. So I'll have a look at exclusive, and I'll play a 3-note sequence. I'm just going to turn these steps off and make it as simple as I possibly can. 4-step sequence, 3 notes. Each note is only ever played once, over 2 octaves. Inclusive. The upper and lower extreme notes are played twice. The arpeggiator is still following its own internal rules. It doesn't matter that we get back round to step number 1 again. The arpeggiator position always advances to the next logical step. Once again, lots of changes made to that thing. Let's throw all of those away. Remove our pitch shift delay. What else have we got? Well, we can randomize the velocities within a range. So if I make this 15%, there or thereabouts, doesn't have to be exact, each one of these velocities now specifies a range over which that note will be randomly played. So it's going to play, each time the arpeggiator comes round, this step 3 is going to play somewhere inside this zone. And you can see that when we get down to 0, there's still a sensible range there. It's going 15% or whatever what did I say, 15.2% above, but obviously it can't go below 0. So there's some common sense being applied to those random values. We can reset all the velocity lines back to their default position by pressing the recycle button, and they all get set to 100. See, they don't go to maximum, they get set to 100. Let's double click it, and that sets it to 100 as well. Let's have a quick look at gate. This is how long each of the notes play for. So let's make the first 3 notes, bring this one back in, very short, and then these longer. Now this step number 7 is actually longer than this step has time to play. So this note is going to basically extend into steps 8 and I think even number 9 here at 215%. This step is very long, so it's effectively forming a chord with the steps that come after it. And these very brief staccato steps at 13%, basically whatever the time slice is that this step has available to it, these notes are going to play for 13% of the time and be silent for the rest. The rate of the entire arpeggiator is controlled by the sync control. So at the moment we're in 1/8, but we're synced to the host tempo. We can go to pure BPM, in which case we've got a completely freeform control, but obviously we're not going to have very much relationship with what's going on in the background with the song. If we go into BPM mode, triplets and dotted are pretty straightforward, self-explanatory. The swing control basically forms pairs between the steps. So steps 1 and 2 will now be paired together. And as we increase the swing, step 1 will last for longer than step 2. So let's set it as far as it can go, which is 75%. And I'm just going to reset all of my gate lengths so that we can make some sense of what's going on here. Long gate, short gate in pairs. 1 long gate, 1 short gate. So that's not going to make much sense if your arpeggio isn't working in pairs. Swing is something that you have to be very careful with. It's very musically context sensitive. Bring it back down to 50, which is the minimum. Finally, the link symbol allows us to create polyrhythms. If I disable linking, you can see that the velocity and the gate have now been disassociated. I can make a different length of velocities from the length of gates. So if we have some randomization between these 2 different patterns, the velocities of the various notes are no longer intrinsically associated with the corresponding gate values. These arpeggios have now gone out of sync with each other. They're playing polyrhythmically. We have 12 steps of velocity sensitive step information, but we only have 8 gates. They're going to cycle around regardless of what the steps up above are doing, which means these gate symbols are no longer going to correspond in a 1-for-1 fashion with the velocity bars or the notes above. So at any given time, this rectangle is defining what's going on with the velocity, and the lower grid is defining what's going on with the gate. Polyrhythms are beyond my feeble brain. Let's turn linking back on. Throw all that away, get back to our basic sound again. Now let's have a look at the effects tab. I don't propose to describe all the various effects units. They're all very straightforward. Phases and choruses and reverbs and delays. You'll have seen these so often. I'm going to presume you know what a chorus sounds like or a distortion sound like. I do want to talk about the configuration of the effects though, because this is a little bit more difficult to get your head around. There are 2 side tabs here, the layer effects and the main effects. Let's deal with layer effects first. Each layer has 2 configurable effects units, 1 and 2. And as you can see, we can set them to anything we want. They're capable of being assigned to modulation destinations. So here we have the dry wet setting for layer A, effect number 1. I'm going to click the plus symbol. And now as you can see, this dry wet setting hasn't currently been mapped to anything. I'm going to assign it to FXA and turn it up. We'll have a look at what this is in a moment. Let's shut that down. Now let's have a look at layer A, effect number 2. When we click the plus symbol for that control, we can see that it already has a value assigned to it. The default preset out of the box. In fact, I'll do this. I'll throw everything away and get back to the completely default preset to show you where that layer A, effect number 2 is being mapped to. Let's have a look at the macros. There's an effects tab for the macros. This is a definable modulation destination. Got 4 controls that we can route into this master FXA control. And at the moment, the second effect in layer A has its dry and wet amount controlled when we turn this dial. Let's move it up and down. And as you can see in the readout below, I'm changing the amount of this effect that's being routed to the output. So why isn't A1 being routed into this effects bank? That's an entirely preset specific thing. Jumping back over to the effects tab, we manually assign these values. And it's perfectly reasonable for us to assign both effects 1 and 2 to the same master FXA control. That's what we did when we increased that value. Now when we jump back over to the macros tab, they've both been assigned. And as you can see, it's a top-down list. So the items at the top of this list are always populated first, and it kind of self-corrects its ordering. But the consequence of that is that the preset default already had A2 assigned. We added A1, and now they're basically upside down. If your OCD can't let you handle that, no problem. Go back into the effects, disconnect effect number 2 by double-clicking it. So now this effect unit is no longer assigned to this master macro control. Over in the macros page, now only A1 is populated. It's shuffled up in the list. Now, unfortunately, we can't assign anything from inside this screen. All of these macro pages are read-only. Back over to the effects page we go and dial it back in. And now A1 and A2 are ordered properly. None of that was necessary. Please understand that you don't need to do any of that stuff. I'm just kind of wandering around the interface to show you how all of these mappings work, because it's actually a very complex routing matrix behind the scenes. And the more you throw these things away and put them back in, it just gives you a good intuitive understanding of how things work. So what this means is that A1 and A2 are now mapped to the same control. In other words, the pitch shift delay and the phaser can both be increased or decreased with a single control, this FXA knob. So there's no pitch shift delay or phasing. I'm going to make this effect as dramatic as possible. You can hear that phasing really clearly, and you can also hear the pitch shift bouncing. Those lower notes are coming from the pitch shift bounce, and they're also heavily phased. Now these macro controls can also be assigned to modulation sources. So this FXA knob that's now doing 2 different jobs, when we move this single control, it's controlling 2 different dry wet levels simultaneously. That can in turn be controlled from a modulation source. So let's click our plus button and let's map it to the modulation wheel. And now my modulation wheel is controlling this master knob, this macro knob. Quick point to note about my modulation wheel: when I turn it all the way down, I only get halfway, because the knob itself is basically arbitrarily adding half of its range before we even start with adding any additional modulation from the mod wheel. Pull that control all the way down, and now my mod wheel is a genuine 100% control of the FXA level. In other words, the dry wet level of both the pitch shift delay and the phaser. The plugin's master effects, delay and reverb, these live outside the concept of layers. These are applied across the entire plugin, but they're treated exactly the same. The things that can be routed into these controls are entirely specific. We saw in episode number 1 the plugin does a very good job of constraining what you can do. You can't map some random control into this delay knob. You can only actually map settings from the master delay itself, which is over here in the main tab of the effects page. So all of these controls here, as you can see, can be mapped into master delay. And there it is, delay input volume. The other kind of macro that we have are these sound macros. There are 4 of them: color, morph, time, and motion. And these are generic descriptions that actually many different things can be routed into. Now on the master page, the front interface that we've hardly looked at in this video series because we've done a lot of advanced editing, this master morph control is actually hardwired routed into these layer A's part 1 and 2. So this is basically how we control the 4-way. As you turn that morph knob, what you're basically doing is using these controls here. In addition to those 4 hardwired volumes, we have another 8 slots. So on the morph knob, you've got 2 at the bottom and then another 6 for a total of 8 assignable parameter controls. You can send pretty much anything you want into these, but once they're all filled up, you can't add any extras. Let's have a very quick demonstration of that. I'll actually use the time control because there's only a couple of empty slots and it'll be easier for us to fill them up. I'll use the filter envelopes to do this job. So let's start randomly assigning stuff to the time control. Now you can see filter A attack has been added to the time control. Now a bit of decay, add that one in. That's all of the slots filled. When I try to add a new one now, let's go over to the filter B. The time slot is no longer available. The plugin understands that all of the slots are full and you just don't get the opportunity to accidentally overwrite something. If we want to assign filter B attack to this time control now, we'd have to take one of the other ones away. Jump back over to decay, take that away. Now we've got an empty slot to which we can assign the attack. And that brings us to the end of the tutorial series. I really hope you enjoyed it. Please hit like if you did. It helps me out with the YouTube algorithm stuff. Thanks very much for watching. See you next time.